Welcome to the Discovery of Deduction. I am Mrs. Hodge, Joelle Hodge. I'll be your host throughout the entire text here as we go through this curriculum. I have been a teacher of the Discovery of Deduction for many, many years now, more than I care to admit on video. And I'm probably going to go through this as if you were in one of my actual Discovery of Deduction classes, one of my classrooms. I'll probably talk to you the way that I talk to my students when I'm live and in class with them. This course will be more than us just kind of going exactly through the pages. I always take an opportunity in teaching this class, usually because it's for targeted at middle school students. That doesn't mean that it couldn't be also used for students outside of that middle school range. But because it's usually targeted at that middle school level, probably 8th, 9th grade or so, I usually take this opportunity to also incorporate in some really good scholarship skills, things like note-taking and highlighting and marking your text, how to answer with, just basic things like complete sentences and all of that kind of good stuff as well. So in addition to learning the logic and the content, there'll probably be some elements of scholarship, student scholarship that I weave in as well. Additionally, I try to come up with some real-world examples, some examples that will help, in some cases, bring the text to life, that will give you an opportunity to engage with things in a more real way. What this course is essentially trying to teach you is learning two things, and these are sort of the high-level things that it's going to be teaching you. There's lots of specific things that it should be teaching you as well. But the high-level things that it should be teaching you is how to make inferences, what is a reasonable argument to make when you're given a set of premises, what should the conclusion be, learning how to make those kinds of inferences, and then to test those inferences, to test those arguments for validity. And so part of what I'm going to try to do is give you some real-world examples that will help bring that process to life for you. Everything that's in this book has been kind of boiled down to make exercises pretty easy to achieve. In this textbook, we can't have assigned you reading in some great philosophical text or some, great historical text or some other textbook, because then you would spend the majority of your time reading and analyzing those things instead of focusing on logic. So we've had to go out and sort of curate all that information and bring in these really sort of quick bite-sized examples from all different walks of life, all different disciplines, and bring them in here, which means that it's kind of an artificial environment when you're in this textbook. Logic isn't really any good to anybody if it lives inside a textbook. The whole point of logic is that it comes outside of the confines of the textbook covers, and you take it with you out into the real world, and you're using it and applying it in some really specific ways, but to the entire world around you. And so while the textbook itself has to have some confines put on it with the kinds of examples that are provided there, the instruction that I can provide might allow us to start to see places where we can take it outside of the textbook in some of those really important ways as well. So there will be some add-ons to the text along the lines of what kinds of examples I bring in and that I can share with you here. Again, this would be the exact same curriculum that you would get if you were taking one of my classes live, either through School A Academy or many, many years ago when I worked at a school. So all that to say, there'll be we're definitely going to go through the entire book here. We're going to cover everything that's in here, but you're also going to get some added benefits to the course as well. I should say, I don't go through every single set of examples with you as far as covering homework. That won't be something that I do on a regular basis. There is a teacher guide, there is an answer key that goes along with the text. I'll be going through some of those examples, particularly the ones where I have seen students really kind of struggle over the years to come up with what the right answer is. And I'll probably use those as examples for how to how to come up with the correct answers. But for some of the basic examples, I won't be spending the time on camera to go through those. For example, when a chapter section asks you to define validity, I'm pretty sure that you can flip to the back of the book and look up the word validity in the glossary and put that into the appropriate slot in the homework assignment. We won't go over answers like that. So all that to say, that's a little bit about what this course is going to cover. That's going to be a little bit more than what's in the book itself. And we can kind of proceed understanding that there'll be those sort of add-ons that come along with going through the video this way. I'd like to turn our attention now to another little bit of introduction, and this is along the lines of those scholarship skills. I'm a huge fan of Mortimer Adler. If you're only in 8th or 9th grade, I don't recommend that you read his book, How to Read a Book. I don't recommend that you read it yet. That book is really written for probably students no younger than maybe juniors, seniors in high school, but definitely college freshmen. So I've read that book as an adult. And I hope that a lot of your teachers have also read that book. He really does break down how to tackle getting into a text. And so I'm going to try to incorporate some of the different elements of Mortimer Adler's instruction about how to read a book, and in this case, how to read this textbook. And one of the things that there's different levels of reading, different kinds of reading that we do. He's not really talking about the idea of stringing together words and making sentences. You all know how to do that. But they're beyond just learning basically how to read. There is a way to tackle the getting into a subject through a book. And that's what part I'm really going to focus on in this class. So I'd like to turn your attention to one of the first elements that Adler brings up, and that is when you're beginning a study, you always want to begin at the table of contents. If you are like a lot of the students in my class, the first thing you do when you get a textbook is flip to the page 1, meaning the first page of instruction, and you skip right over the table of contents. But I'm going to have us turn our attention to the table of contents, and here, if you look at the digital version that I have here on the screen, the table of contents goes through, and if you have a different edition of the book because of the timing of when this book was made, you might want to just kind of ignore these page numbers here because they may have changed over time. As we go through this video series, I'll be referring to these lessons based on their lesson number and not on their page number, so you can just ignore those page numbers there off to the side. But I did want us to sort of look at some of these big pieces here, the different unit headings. And I'll turn the page when we get over to Unit 3. The first thing we want to look at here is that we have an introductory unit that comes first, which is wholly appropriate. If you're looking at the introduction, it talks about an introduction to formal logic, and it really highlights here in Lesson 1 that there's a difference between formal logic and informal logic. Hopefully, you have taken a course like The Art of Argument, which is the prequel to this course. Logic is like a two-sided coin. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in lessons to come. But logic is like a two-sided coin. It's both an art and a science, but it's one thing. And The Art of Argument, by the title, you might be able to hear in there, that it would suggest that the art of argument focuses on the artistic side of logic, and this course and the discovery of deduction is going to focus on the scientific side or the deductive side of logic. But in order to get a real introduction to logic, you really have to do both an introduction to informal logic and an introduction to formal logic, an introduction to induction and an introduction to deduction. This course serves as an introduction to that formal deductive side of logic. So I'm going to, the assumption in this course is that you have taken the equivalent of an Art of Argument class where you've gotten into the inductive side of logic. There are lots of different kinds of texts out there that really go through maybe some informal fallacies, but they don't really get into the nature of what makes for an inductive argument. And so if you've only maybe taken a class where you've just learned a couple of fun informal fallacies, like what the ad hominem arguments are, and maybe what a slippery slope fallacy is, and maybe a straw man fallacy, but you haven't really dug into the difference between induction and deduction, then that first lesson, lesson 1.1, that's really going to be a lot more meaty for you. than it will be for somebody who's already taken an introductory class in the artistic side of logic. If you've already taken a class like the art of argument, then chances are that first lesson will be a review. So it really kind of depends here whether you've taken an actual course that has gone through some of that, or if this is really one of your first real logic classes, and not just sort of a little bit of an exploration of informal fallacies. I hope I've explained that pretty well. But the rest of chapter 1, going through those, again, that could be largely review for you, or if you didn't have a course in inductive logic, that might be 100% new material for you, which means you'll probably approach that differently. I'm going to proceed with this course as if you have taken a course in inductive logic before you've taken this class. So there may be some holes and gaps where I'm assuming that you know something that maybe you don't. If that's the case, you might want to consider some other resources, or maybe you push pause on this particular course and you go and do a little bit more work on that other inductive side, so that you've got you've got a little bit better starting point. That choice is up to you. Then we move into chapter 2 and chapter 3. Chapter 2 is a brief history of logic, and there's going to be two parts to that. That's actually a lot of fun, because we get to take a little bit of a history detour, really kind of set the stage. Anytime you're going through being introduced to anything, it's always good to know where are you in time and space, what's come before, what's impacting you. So looking back at the history of logic gives us sort of sets the stage for where we are now in time and space, and how we use logic and what it's good for, and all those kinds of things. And we can also then start to project a little bit about what logic is going to be good for going forward, how that's going to be helpful, where you might be able to use it, and how we can apply it for you in a very specific way. A lot of students tend to think that once we get to this deductive side of logic, this scientific side of logic, that it's not going to have any real world application. It's just going to be used for propositional logic and code writing and number theory and all of those kinds of things. And there is definitely a track where that becomes a way that you can use this kind of deductive reasoning to go in that direction. But we also have to know, and we'll talk about this a little bit more too, that the art of rhetoric, which is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. That definition is taken from Aristotle himself about what rhetoric is. When you look at rhetoric and a formal study of rhetoric, Aristotle is not only the author of deductive logic, but he's also the father of rhetoric. Rhetoric is a way of communication. It's a way of language. It's a way of expression. And so he assumes in his rhetoric teaching that all of his students have taken the class that you're about to take, that they've done this sort of fundamental basics of logic, because logic is the foundation for rhetoric. So logic can't just be something that turns into math at some point. Logic actually helps you become a better writer. And for the purposes of this class, I'm going to be guiding us through and pointing us to ways that this logic class, not just the artistic side, but also this formal scientific side of logic, how this can help you become a better writer as well. So there are going to be a lot of very immediate real-world applications for you in your scholarship, in your student work, in writing papers. There's going to be a lot of places where you can begin to exercise these skills that you're going to use, and not just have it be something, kind of interesting that you do if you want to go on to higher level scientific logic sometime in the future. This has real-world application for your writing. And do you want to be a better writer? This class will probably help you get there. If we look then to Unit 2, Chapter 3, we talk about formal logic and the three acts of the mind. We'll get into what that is, but that all encompasses what the introduction to the class is going to be. So now you kind of know sort of, how things are going to go and how the beginning of the class is going to take shape. Unit 2 is going to be propositions and their relationships, and this is where we really get past that introductory material and we start building some very, very concrete skill sets for you to be using. And this is also where, and I will say this again when we get to Unit 2, there are times and places in education where your creativity is encouraged and required. A lot of what goes on in units 2 and units 3 of this course are places where we do not need your creativity. This is going to be a place where things are going to be very black and white, where you have to follow the rules of what's being laid out very systematically, where it's going to say you need to have your sentences look exactly this way, and we mean it. The sentences have to look exactly this way. We're going to say that there's certain rules that apply, and those rules are strict and unforgiving. And we just have to understand that there are places where you can demonstrate your creativity and you can use that side of who you are. But then there are other places where we really do have to just sort of conform and follow the rules. And I talk about this when we get to Unit 2 as well, that when you're looking at a building, for instance, you don't want the architect and the engineer who are giving you the structural foundation for whether or not the building is going to stand. We don't want them necessarily exercising lots and lots of creativity, bending the rules and trying out new things, right? Because we want that structure to be solid and sound and, keep us safe if it's our home, if it's our business, if we're traveling, whatever it might be. We really want them to be good rule followers. Now, the interior designer, exactly how the walls look, exactly, what the furniture patterns are, what murals might get painted, what the lighting fixtures are like, which faucets are picked out, all of that sort of creative element, we are fine with people exercising their creativity there. This class is that architectural construction side of argumentation. And this part of logic has to be solid, it has to be routine, it has to follow very specific prescriptions, and we have to make these structures valid and sound. That's what we're really after here. So there's not a lot of opportunity for creativity and expression and changing things up. And that's just that's just sort of a reflection of what this course is. So there will be times when you're going through and checking your answers and the textbook says that things have to be a certain way, and they actually might have to be exactly that way to be correct. And I'll try to highlight some of those places for you as we go through answers and as we're going through the text itself. Unit 2, as I said, is one of those places. First, we're going to be getting into translating propositions into categorical form. Then we're going to be talking about the relationships of propositions and how they are opposed to each other. And then we're going to be talking about relationships of equivalence and how we can create relationships, how we can take one kind of a statement and restate it so it's saying the exact same thing, but perhaps more clearly in some way. All of this is giving us ways to manage propositions and take arguments and statements in regular, ordinary language and boil them down to these very small core pieces that we need to in order to be able to test our arguments for validity. And more of that will be explained as we go. Then there's Unit 3 and Unit 4. There's only 4 units in this text. This Unit 3 here, Unit 3 is all about categorical syllogisms. This assumes that you have understood how to translate statements from ordinary form into their strict logic categorical form so that we can build arguments in this very kind of strict way so that we can test them for validity. In this way, we often look at logic a lot like it's kind of like math. By the time you get to algebra, you're not going back and reviewing what your number line is, and you're not going back and reviewing what addition is and subtraction and that kind of thing. It's assumed that you have learned all of that information and we're building on top of it. In other words, math is cumulative. This logic class is also cumulative. What's come before in Unit 2 is expected that you have mastered that information so that you can bring it with you and you can build on top of it for this Unit 3, and the same thing for Unit 4. As a result, it's going to be very important that before you move on from Unit 2 to Unit 3, that you've really gone through and made sure that you understand those concepts very, very well. It's been my experience in the past, having tutored in math, that when I work with students who maybe have had gaps in their understanding, when they get to me for maybe pre-calculus and they're really struggling with the concept, usually it's not a subject, it's not a concept that they just bumped into in pre-calculus. Usually it's some big hole in their understanding from way back. And we have to go all the way back and fill in that hole so that they can better understand what they're doing in pre-calculus in present day. I'd like you to do as much as you can to make sure that you filled in those gaps. So if there's something that you're not understanding from Unit 2, go back, rewatch the lesson. You can always have your parents or you can always email in, and there we have an Ask the Magister option here at Classical Academic Press. So if you're really stumped on something and you don't quite understand why there's a question that's been marked, or why you got something wrong, or how it doesn't work, how it fits together, and there might be some confusion, you can always send in your question. And very often I'm the one that answers those questions, but sometimes we have someone else answer those questions too, but we could certainly get you an answer for sure. So make sure that you really do focus on mastery before you move on to categorical syllogisms here in Unit 3. The last unit is Unit 4. We call that Terms and Definitions. And this is a unit that really could be done as a Unit 2, so we could do these out of order if we want to, but we went ahead and put this as Unit 4. It's a unit that kind of it works independently from Units 2 and 3. 2 and 3 have to go back to back, but Unit 4 could be learned kind of in either place, earlier in the year or later in the year. We've gone ahead and put it here later in the year, and this is really where we get into even a further understanding that there is a real construction and a much more going on in a sentence than you might realize. Many students who take logic have probably taken lots of grammar classes, especially Latin classes, where you've learned how to diagram a sentence and you know what all the different parts are called. But sometimes this class offers you a depth of understanding into the syntax of the sentence, where you understand not just where all of the different pieces are and what all of the different parts of a sentence are called, but you understand that just where they occupy space creates effects for what the sentence is actually communicating. You'll understand a little bit more about what I mean, especially when we get to relationships of equivalence and we start really getting into sentence construction a little bit for some of the exercises in there. But one of the things that you'll learn throughout the entirety of this course here is being very intentional and precise as you choose your language is going to be something that's required more and more of you. If there's one thing that I've noticed with students over the years, it's that we get kind of lackadaisical sometimes about the word choice that we use and how we actually construct our sentences. We're kind of assuming that people will sort of understand us. I tell my students that growing up in your home, your parents have learned to speak you. I have a daughter, and her name is Anna, and when she talks to me, I can usually decipher what she means because I've learned to speak Anna. I understand when she's being a little bit kind of lackadaisical with her language. I've learned when she kind of embellishes things. I've learned when she's maybe adding drama for effect, and then I can kind of sort of translate in my mind and figure out exactly what she means, and I don't have to correct her all the time and say, you weren't exactly precise right here. Well, your parents and your pastors and your friends and so forth, everybody has sort of learned to speak you over the years. And as a result, if nobody challenges you on it, you kind of forget that there is a more intentional, more precise, more mature way to approach your subjects and your writing. Very often we have to learn to kind of have two voices. One voice where you can be your casual, everyday self when you're talking with friends and hanging out and just being yourself. But you might have to adopt a more academic voice, not just for this class, but for your other classes, where you beef up your vocabulary, you change up your sentence structure a little bit, you avoid colloquialisms and too many metaphors in your sentence or, exaggeration for effect, that you really are much more careful with how you express yourself, the words you choose to express yourself, and that kind of thing. Getting into this idea of terms and definitions in Unit 4 here, that's one of those places where we usually are reminded that we have to we have to start to bring ourselves into having an academic voice. If we really want to express ourselves clearly, concisely, and effectively, we do have to be very intentional and purposeful when we choose our words, choose our language, and decide how to express ourselves. And so Unit 4 gives us some rules for how we can go about doing that. Again, all of this with the purpose of giving you the skills to be able to create accurate statements, build valid arguments, express yourself well for the purposes of persuasive writing, for all different kinds of writing that you might do, but self-expression in general. So there's a lot of information that comes at you through this course, and a lot of it can be directly applied if you're interested in doing more with this class than just filling in the blank and getting the right answer. So I hope that you'll take this opportunity to use this course as a way to help refine and kind of check yourself for how you manage your writing and your academic pursuits. There's a lot here that you could apply to yourself beyond just getting all the right answers in this logic textbook. So that's something else to keep in mind. Beyond that, you can also see that there's going to be endnotes in the text. Some appendices as well. We'll be referring to this appendix A, quite frequently over the years. We'll also get into Appendix B when we get into Venn diagrams and valid syllogisms. Some of the other ones here we'll be hitting as well. Endnotes can be very helpful so that you can see where we have quoted and where those quotes are coming from, who the quote is from, that kind of thing. A lot of our examples that we give are quotes from various sources. And when you're in the text itself, when you see a superscript number, that's where you see a line of text. Let's see here if I can give you an example quickly of an end note real quickly. Here's one. You're reading along and you see this, right? Therefore I am, i.e. I exist. And there's this superscript, number 5, super meaning above the script, right? Above the script. Number 5, what that means is that we are in chapter 1, lesson 1.1, and if you go to the end of your book into the endnote section, you will find that there is a corresponding note here to tell you where this reference comes from. So sometimes endnotes can be very helpful when you're trying to figure out exactly who said something and how to interpret it, because who says it and what context they said it in can often be very important when you're trying to figure out whether or not you want to assign a truth value to some different language. You want to make sure that you understood that it wasn't just lifted out of context, that you really do appreciate where it came from and what the bigger part of what they were saying is, that kind of thing. So there's endnotes here. Then of course I mentioned that there will be a use for your glossary for sure. There are always bold-faced type throughout the text where there will be terms introduced, but the best, the most concisely worded definition will always be in the glossary. So that might be a quick handy reference. I've actually told my students to go ahead and just put a post-it note back there so they can find that easily and they can just flip to it quickly when they're doing their review exercises. That's the entirety of the table of contents, and hopefully that's given you a little bit of an idea about where we currently are and where we're going with this class. And a little bit more about how there will be some, there's definitely going to be some completion exercises in here, but there's going to be so much more that you can do with the information in this text. And I hope that you'll find some good application points as we go through for the other work that you're doing in your scholarship.